Imagine you are a medieval king. You have enemies on every border, rebellion is always possible, and somewhere beyond your walls, another army may already be preparing to attack. So you decide to build a castle. Not a small house, not a palace, a fortress of stone, powerful enough to survive an army. But there is a problem. You cannot simply choose a piece of land and start stacking stones. Building a medieval castle could take years, require thousands of workers, enormous amounts of material, and a fortune in money. And every wall, tower, gate, and ditch had to serve a purpose. So how exactly did medieval people build a castle? To understand, we have to go back to the beginning. Before the first stone was placed, the most important decision had to be made. Where should the castle stand? A good location could make a castle extremely difficult to attack. A bad location could turn even the strongest fortress into a death trap. Medieval builders looked for high ground whenever possible. A hilltop provided a natural advantage. Attackers approaching the castle would have to climb upward while defenders could fire arrows, throw stones, and launch other projectiles down from above. But height wasn't the only consideration. The builders also needed access to water. A castle under siege might need to survive for weeks or even months. Without a reliable water supply, the defenders could be forced to surrender. Nearby roads were also important. A castle wasn't only a place to hide, it could control trade routes, river crossings, mountain passes, and important territories. The location, therefore, had to balance defense, resources, transportation, and political power. Once the site was chosen, construction could finally begin. The first workers didn't build towers. They cleared the ground. Trees had to be cut down, bushes and vegetation were removed, uneven ground was leveled, and the area where the walls would stand had to be carefully prepared. If the castle was being built on a hill, workers might have to cut directly into the rock. If it was being built on softer ground, engineers had to create strong foundations capable of supporting enormous stone walls. This was one of the most important stages, because if the foundation failed, the entire castle could eventually collapse. And medieval builders had no modern cranes, excavators, or concrete mixers. Almost everything depended on human and animal labor. Now the real construction began. The builders first dug deep trenches along the planned walls. Then they filled these foundations with large stones and other materials. The purpose was simple: spread the enormous weight of the castle into the ground. A medieval castle could contain thousands of tons of stone. The walls had to withstand not only their own weight, but also weather, fire, and attacks. Engineers therefore had to think carefully about the shape and thickness of the walls. The larger the castle, the more complicated the engineering became. And then came one of the biggest challenges: getting the stone. A castle required an astonishing amount of material. Stone was usually obtained from nearby quarries whenever possible. Workers extracted large blocks using simple tools, wedges, hammers, chisels, and wooden devices. The stone was then shaped by skilled craftsmen. Not every piece needed to look perfect. Some stones were used as rough rubble inside walls. Other stones, especially those visible on the outside, were carefully cut and fitted together. This created a strong wall with a carefully finished exterior. But transporting the stone was another enormous challenge. Heavy blocks had to be moved from the quarry to the construction site. Carts pulled by horses or oxen could carry some materials. But for extremely heavy stones, medieval builders relied on sledges, rollers, ramps, and teams of workers. And once the stone reached the castle, someone had to lift it. This is where medieval engineering becomes fascinating. Builders used cranes, lifting devices, ropes, pulleys, wooden frames, and human or animal power. One particularly important machine was the treadwheel crane. Imagine a giant wooden wheel large enough for a person to walk inside. As the worker walked, the wheel turned. That movement powered a system of ropes and pulleys capable of lifting heavy stones. It was slow. It was exhausting. But it worked. Piece by piece, stone by stone, the walls began to rise. And the higher the walls became, the more dangerous the work became. A medieval castle wall was not simply a single layer of stone. Many large walls were constructed with an outer layer of carefully arranged stone, an inner layer, and a core made from smaller stones and mortar. The walls could become extremely thick. Why? Because a thin wall could be smashed or weakened by attackers. A thick wall could absorb enormous punishment. But thickness also created another advantage. It provided space for defenders. Walkways could be constructed along the top of the walls. From there, soldiers could watch the surrounding countryside and attack enemies below. The wall was therefore both a shield and a weapon. But even the strongest wall had one dangerous weakness: the entrance. Every castle needed a way in and out, and that entrance was usually one of the most heavily defended parts of the entire fortress. The solution was the gatehouse. Instead of allowing enemies to approach a simple wooden door, builders created a fortified entrance surrounded by thick walls and towers. Attackers might first encounter a ditch or moat, then a drawbridge, then a massive gate, and behind that gate could be another barrier. Some castles also used portcullises, heavy wooden or metal-reinforced gates that could be lowered vertically. If attackers somehow passed the first barrier, they could find themselves trapped inside a narrow passage. Defenders could attack them from above. This created one of the most terrifying situations for a medieval soldier: entering the castle without knowing whether you would ever come back out. Next came the towers. Towers served several purposes. They gave defenders a better view of the surrounding land. They allowed archers to fire along the sides of walls, and they made it much harder for attackers to approach the castle without being seen. Early castles often used simple square towers, but later builders increasingly used rounded towers in many regions because curved walls could provide advantages against certain forms of attack and reduce vulnerable corners. Towers also became living spaces. A castle was not just a military installation. It was a home, and someone important had to live there. Behind the defensive walls was another world. The inner castle could contain a great hall, kitchens, storage rooms, wells, chapels, private chambers, workshops, stables, and living quarters. The great hall was often the social center. Meals were held there, meetings took place there, important guests were received there. But the castle also needed to function during war. Food had to be stored, weapons had to be maintained, horses needed shelter, and soldiers needed somewhere to sleep. A castle, therefore, had to operate like a small community. Hundreds of people could live and work inside or around a major fortress. Stone walls were excellent for defense, but they were not exactly comfortable. A medieval castle could be cold, dark, and damp. Windows were often small, especially in defensive areas. Fireplaces provided warmth. Curtains, tapestries, wooden furniture, and other materials helped make rooms more comfortable. Food was prepared in large kitchens. Grain, meat, salt, wine, ale, and other supplies could be stored for long periods. And water was essential. Some castles had wells inside their walls. Others depended on cisterns or carefully managed external sources. Because during a siege, A castle's greatest enemy might not be the army outside. It might be hunger and thirst. Once the main structure was complete, the castle became a defensive machine. Walls, towers, gates, moats, drawbridges, battlements, every feature had a purpose. The battlements at the top of the walls allowed defenders to stand behind protective sections while still being able to attack enemies. Openings could allow archers and other weapons to target attackers. Some castles also used features that allowed defenders to attack enemies directly below the walls. The basic principle was simple: make the attacker exposed, keep the defender protected. A well-designed castle forced an enemy to overcome one obstacle after another. But all of this came at an enormous price. Stone had to be quarried, wood had to be cut, metal had to be forged, food had to be supplied to workers, animals had to be fed, skilled craftsmen had to be paid, and thousands of laborers might be needed over many years. For a powerful ruler, building a castle could represent a huge investment. But the castle itself could generate power. It could control land, protect important people, store wealth, house soldiers, and demonstrate the authority of the ruler who built it. A castle was therefore more than a building. It was a political statement carved into stone. But there was another side to the construction. Building a castle was dangerous. Workers could fall from scaffolding, heavy stones could crush people, ropes could break, tools could cause serious injuries. Disease and exhaustion were constant threats, and medieval construction sites had none of the safety equipment modern workers take for granted. Yet, the work continued, day after day, month after month, year after year. Stone by stone, the fortress slowly emerged. Eventually, after years of construction, the castle stood complete. From a distance, it could look almost impossible to conquer. Massive walls rose above the landscape, towers watched the roads, the gatehouse guarded the entrance. Inside were soldiers, servants, craftsmen, animals, food, weapons, and the Lord's household. But no castle was truly invincible. Armies could surround it, supplies could run out, walls could be attacked, and political power could change. A castle's greatest defense was often not its stone. It was the ability of its defenders to survive longer than the enemy could maintain the siege. Today, many medieval castles stand as ruins. Their roofs have disappeared. Their wooden structures have rotted away. Their walls have been damaged by centuries of weather and conflict. But the stones remain. And those stones tell a story. They tell us about kings and soldiers, about engineers and craftsmen, about workers who spent years building structures they might never live to see completed. A medieval castle was not created overnight. It was the product of engineering, labor, money, politics, and fear. Every tower had a purpose. Every gate had a weakness to defend. Every stone represented human effort. And perhaps that is what makes medieval castles so fascinating. They were built to survive war. But centuries later, it is the castles themselves that survived. While the kingdoms that built them have disappeared. The armies are gone. The kings are gone. The builders are gone. But their fortresses still stand. Silent reminders of a world where survival could depend on stone walls, and where building a castle was one of the greatest engineering challenges of the medieval age. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.